It's good to be with you today. I love this church. I used to have cousins and great aunts and all kinds of folks that used to attend here. And so it's made it real special to be here to worship with you again today. I love a good story. And if somebody tells me a good story and they keep me mesmerized, I just like to really get into it. And last Sunday, I heard a really good story, not from the preacher, although I hear good stories from preachers. And I hope I can keep you awake for a few minutes today. But there's a young man named Joseph Bryant, who about 15 years ago, I was a minister at the South MacArthur Church of Christ in Irving, and he was one of the singles there. And he began to date a girl named Janae. He and Janae were very spiritual. And I performed their wedding ceremony. They wanted to have children really bad. And they tried, and Janae did get pregnant, but she had a miscarriage and was not able to have children anymore. And so they decided that they would adopt. And the way I found out, and that's kind of where it came into the story, is they decided to adopt. And when they decided to adopt, they decided they wanted to adopt somebody that maybe no one else would adopt. And so they went and looked, and they found a special needs girl. She was, I think, 9.5 years old, and her name was Ashley. And she was in a wheelchair. She could not talk. And they decided that's the kind of person that we feel like God's calling us to be parents to, and they adopted her. Well, when I visited this church last Sunday, I hadn't seen Joseph in maybe 10 years. And just so happened he walked out of a classroom, and I said, "I can't believe I'm seeing you here." And he grabbed me and hugged me, and he said, "Tim, have you got just a minute? I've got to tell you how God has been working in my life." Now, what I already knew is I already knew a little bit already, but he began to tell me. He said, "I see how God's hand has woven itself in my life in such incredible ways." And he said, one of them was just giving us Ashley, and how wonderful it's been to raise somebody. It hasn't been easy, but it's been wonderful. But he said, then we got real attached to a friend who was in our, I think, a small group, he said. And he said this couple became real close, and they helped us. And we were appreciative of that. But this husband and wife, she got cancer and began to suffer. And he says, we helped them through that time the best we could, but his wife passed away. And he said in about 2 or 3 years, he said, Janae got cancer. And he said, God was at work. He says, I was sad that my wife had cancer, but I had somebody who was close to me who could help me through what he had been through with his wife just a few years before. And he said, he stood by my side. He helped me when I needed help. And Janae fought for about a year, and then Janae passed away. And he said, I thought life was over. He said, I didn't know what I could do. How could I raise Ashley by myself? And he said, then then I stayed involved with my church family, and they took care of me, and they encouraged me, and they worked with me. And he said, one day I was visiting, and one person in my church said, did you know there's a church? It's a mother church to ours. It's another church just up the road, and it's in Keller. And he said, you need to visit there because that church has a Bible class for special need kids. He said, so I went over, and he said, I visited. And he said, they started helping me wonderfully with Janae, with Ashley. And he said, then he said, they had somebody come in and they built a special wing onto their church building just for at-risk kids. because there were a lot of people in their congregation who didn't know what to do. They had to take care of that person all the time because there was nothing they could do, and they didn't have anybody that knew how to work with them. So they hired a staff, and they built a special place. He said they even went out and they made sure that everybody that had special needs had a parking place that had plenty of room to unload wheelchairs. And he said, my name is on that, so I have a place to park so I can get my daughter into class. He said, you can't imagine how God has worked. He said, come on, I want you to meet Ashley. And he took me back and he showed me and he introduced me to Ashley. She was in a wheelchair. She couldn't talk. She's now 18 years old. She, just kind of had a far away look in her eyes. And yet, man, you should have seen him and how much he loved her. And I could see God was at work. Because Joseph could have told me a different story. You understand that? His first words were, look how God is working in my life. Well, my point today is, how's God working in your life? How are you looking at God's presence all the time? And even through the hardships, see how He's got His hand in working and helping you through that. Well, I think hearing that story, I think God, it was like the man who was doing communion a while ago, or, it's kind of like God was giving me a nudge. He knew I was speaking on this. I already told what I was speaking on. And all of a sudden I had this story that I thought was incredible. And I got to thinking, do you know the story of God? If someone were to ask you and say, can you tell me the story of God? I remember we used to have to give book reports. Remember? That's a pretty big book. I'd hate to have to give a big book report on the Bible, especially if you had to get it down to a page. You know what I mean? You just got to get it down. Can you say something really fast? Well, I think we ought to be able to tell the story pretty good and pretty fast. But do we think about how do we tell the story of God? God created the world, and it was good. And He created man in His own image. And He said, that's very good. He said, I want you to go live in my world in a very special garden. He says, the only thing I ask you to do, you take care of the garden and don't eat of that tree of knowledge of good and evil. But He said, if you eat of that tree, you will surely die. Sure enough, Adam and Eve ate of that tree. And when they ate of that tree, God, who could be present with them at the time. He could walk in the garden. He could visit with them. They were with Him. But He came through the garden and He couldn't find Adam and Eve. And He says, Adam, where are you? And Adam says, we're hiding. And God knew that he had eaten of the tree because the tree separated him from Adam and Eve. Eating of that fruit, he had disobeyed, and sin had separated him. And God hatched a plan. He had done all of this, but He wanted man to have a relationship back with Him. And so He had to kick them out of the garden. And they eventually died, just like all of us have died since then. And so that's the way it was. That's just the way it was. And so God had a plan, and He took the whole Old Testament, and He told how people tried their very best to do what God wanted them to do, and boy, they messed up a bunch, didn't they? But God still had a plan, and He never gave up. He never gave up because He finally came back to earth. His Son came back to earth, Jesus. And Jesus said, I will be the one who pays the price for your sin. I will die for your sin. You don't have to die. Oh, we still have to die physically, but you will not die spiritually. And He says, if you will put your faith in me and put your trust in me, I will reconcile you back to a relationship with God. And He said, and then He left. He taught us how to live. He taught us how to live our life by faith. And then He said, I'm going to go away, but I'm coming back again. And I'm going to take you to be where I am. and you will be forever in the presence of God. And the earth will once again be the Garden of Eden. Okay? That's a pretty quick story of God, wasn't it? That's what it was. That's it. That's it. That's God's story. Boy, I'm glad that he sent his son Jesus. And we just celebrated that in communion. Well, that's God's story. You know, I got to thinking, what's my story? I've got a story. And God's had his hand in it all the way through. I was born in Florence, Alabama, to Christian parents. My mother and father were wonderful people. My dad was a preacher. I didn't always like being a preacher's kid, but he was a preacher. My mother was a music teacher and a piano teacher. And I learned Jesus from my mother and daddy. They brought me up. They brought me up in the Church of Christ. I learned so many good things in the church. My dad taught at a Christian school called Mars Hill, and I learned so much from that. It's in Florence, Alabama. When I was 11, I can remember going to my dad and saying, "Dad, I want to be baptized." And he sent me into my room, and he said, "I want you to pray." And I went into my room and prayed. It was a Sunday afternoon. And he was preaching in a gospel meeting, not in a little church not too far away. And we went to the meeting that night. I walked down the aisle to why not tonight, you know? A lot of you came to Just As I Am, but I came on why not tonight. And I decided to be baptized. I'll never forget it. It was a wonderful experience. But what I found out is God was working way ahead of me before I became a Christian and a follower of Christ. The way I'm really a Christian is there was a garbage man in Fort Collins, Colorado, where my dad lived. His parents, and he had two sisters, they were not active Christians at all. They weren't going to church anywhere. The garbage man always drove down the alley, and he would put his truck into gear, and it would go down, and he would get out of the truck. He'd just let it stay in the grooves. And then he'd grab the cans and dump it in the trunk as he went along. And he knew everybody, every kid in the neighborhood. He just happened to be members of the Church of Christ in Fort Collins. And they were having a vacation Bible school, and he went to my Aunt Opal. She was out watching him unload the garbage, and he said, "Opal, why don't you get your brother and sister, and why don't y'all come to vacation Bible school?" Well, she was about, 8 or 9 years old. She was excited. She ran into her mother and said, "Look, we've been invited to go to church and vacation Bible school. Can we go? Can we go?" My grandmother, she wasn't too hip on that. She said, "Oh, you're as good as any other kid. I guess you can go." She didn't have any concept of Christianity, hardly. Well, they went to vacation Bible school. At the end of vacation Bible school, Mrs. Healy said, "Hey, you kids, you know, we have a Bible class every Sunday at church here. Why don't you come to church on Sundays?" So my brothers and sisters began to go to church on Sunday. My aunts and uncle and my dad began to go to church on Sunday on a regular basis. But then my great uncle Wilbur, my grandmother's brother, he was about 30-some years old, and he got colon cancer, and he got real sick. He lived in Greeley, a little town down from there, and they would go visit him every weekend. They quit going to church. Well, Mrs. Healy noticed that. So she made an effort to get up and go and visit, and knocked on the door, and my grandmother invited her in, and she said, "You know, your kids were coming to Sunday school for a long time. We have sure missed them. We'd sure like for them to start again." And my grandmother, God was at work. She thought, if you take the time enough to come by and sit down and drink a cup of coffee and visit with me, I'll come and I'll get to know you. And my grandmother and my grandfather began to go to church, and they studied, and they were baptized. Eventually, my dad, when he was about 12 years old, he was baptized into Christ. And when he was 15 years old, you know, he broke his arm. And it was bad. It was so bad that he had to get a cast that held it out this way, had a stick that went down. They probably do it different now, but he couldn't write. He couldn't do anything. He dropped out of school. Oh, how terrible that was. So he was out of school for a year, about the 9th or 10th grade. And so I don't think he was planning on going back. But Mrs. Healy, her son, had gone to Harding College. And she came to my grandmother one day and she said, they have an academy at Harding College. Why don't you send your son to the academy and let him finish his high school at Harding? My grandmother thought that was a great idea. I don't know how they could have afford the money, but they did, and they sent my dad. And so while he finished his degree, his high school degree, and while he was there, my mother was in college, and she was dating Mrs. Healy's son. Well, the son was real active, I think, on the annual staff, and he was always doing something, and he was always so busy. And when something would come along, he'd say, Madge, I don't have time to go to that with you, but my roommate Claude will go with you, my dad. Well, it didn't take long that my dad fell in love with my mom, and she fell out of love with the Healy boy. They remained friends. And they got married. And they got married right over here in Rose Hill, Kansas. My mother's from Rose Hill. And the neat thing is my mother has a great story too. You see how God worked at all that? God was at work. I'm here today because of just what I just told you. What if some of those things God hadn't put together? I wouldn't be here. But my grandmother, her family are McCunes. Okay? And they all came from Kentucky. And they just happened to be very involved in the Christians Only movement. And that was started by Barton W. Stone. Okay? And he had a good friend named John Rogers. And I love genealogy, and I work on it almost every day in my family. And in genealogy, I found out that a lot of my great aunts and great uncles were married by John Rogers. And so they became Christians through the Christians Only movement, and then they moved out here to Kansas. And so I remember my grandmother talking about she was a member of the Christian church. She was a Christians Only person. But there wasn't a Christian church at that time in Rose Hill, but there was a Church of Christ, and that's where my grandpa was going. So guess what? Wasn't a whole lot of difference. She began to go to the Church of Christ, okay? And so I have a great uncle who's named Barton W. Warren Stone McCune. Barton Warren Stone McCune. That's his name. So it goes way back. And I see that faith, and I see that faith passing on down till it finally gets to me. And I just can't tell you what it means. I just see God's hand in so many things. Well, I show up at Harding College, and I meet this cute little old girl named Ann Starling. Okay? And man, did I like her. And we started dating our sophomore year, and we were dating all through that year. And during the middle of that sophomore year, her dad and mom came to visit us, and her dad looked at me across. We were in the student center, and her dad looked at me and he said, Tim, we're looking for somebody that'll be a youth that work with our young people for just this summer 1969. Would you come? Well, my carnal mind, I was not in a really great place. Ann was trying to straighten me out. And I said, I don't know. Well, he got back home, and he wrote me a letter and asked me again. But not only did he write me a letter, he knew my folks when they were at Harding. And he wrote my dad a letter, and he said, I want you to encourage your son to come work with me. Was God's hand not in that? I decided I would go and work that summer in 69 because I could spend the summer with my girlfriend. And I was working with young people on the side. But what I didn't know is God had me fall in love with young people. And in 1969, I went back and I started working with young people that fall, driving to my home church from Harding. And I worked there, and I worked with young people for 25 years. And then I worked as associate minister. And then I retired, and my son lived in Wichita, Kansas. And I'm here speaking to you today. Now you say, Tim, why did you tell us? I thought we were here to hear the Bible story. I hope that's a Bible story. That's a God story of how God works. There were just lots of things with that's important. Well, the story that really gets me is Paul's story. We're going to get to the Bible finally, okay? Paul has been on 3 missionary journeys, the New Testament, and he's come back from that 3rd missionary journey, and he's gone to Jerusalem. Now, people didn't trust Paul. They didn't like him very much, and they accused him of taking a Greek into the temple and defiling the temple. And they got a hold of him, and they tried to kill him. But the Roman soldiers came in, and they got him, and they said, no, we're going to take care of him. And so they brought him, took him to another place. And as they were taking him to another place, Paul said, would you let me address those who are accusing me? And the Roman soldiers did. We'll start in chapter 21, verse 48. After receiving the commander's permission, Paul stood on the steps and motioned to the crowd, and when they were all silent, he said to them in Aramaic, brothers and fathers, listen to my defense. When they heard him speak to them in Aramaic, they became very quiet. Then Paul said, I am a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, brought up in this city. I studied under Gamaliel and was thoroughly trained in the law of our ancestors. I was just as zealous as God as any of you are today. I persecuted the followers of the way, or the followers of Christ, to their death, arresting men and women and throwing them into prison. As the high priest and all the council can themselves testify, I even obtained letters from them to their associates in Damascus and went there to bring these people as prisoners to Jerusalem. But about noon, as I came near Damascus, suddenly a bright light from heaven flashed around me. I fell to the ground, and I heard the voice say to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Who are you, Lord? I said. I'm Jesus of Nazareth, whom you're persecuting. He replied. My companions saw the light, but they did not understand the voice of him who was speaking to me. What shall I do, Lord? The Lord said, get up and go into Damascus, and there you were told that you have been assigned to do. My companions led me by the hand into Damascus because the brilliance of the light had blinded me. A man named Ananias came to me, and he was a devout observer of the law and highly respected by the Jews living there. He stood beside me and said, Brother Saul, receive your sight. And at that moment, I was able to see. And then he said, the God of our ancestors has chosen you to know his will and to see the righteous one and to hear words from his mouth. You will be his witness to all people of what you have seen and heard. And now, what are you waiting for? Get up, be baptized, wash away your sins, and call on his name. Then I returned to Jerusalem, and I was praying in the temple, and I fell into a trance and saw the Lord speaking to me. Quick, he said, leave Jerusalem immediately, because the people here will not accept your testimony. Wonder why? He killed most of the Christians that were there, or imprisoned them. Lord, I replied, these people know that I went from one synagogue to another to imprison and beat those who believe in you. And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I stood there giving my approval and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him. Then the Lord said to me, go, I will send you far away to the Gentiles. Now you say, Tim, why did you tell Paul's story? Because it was it was important enough to Luke, who wrote this book. He recorded it as when it happened. And then he recorded it again at this time, and Paul told the story, and he recorded it again. And then over in chapter 26, and he recorded it again. He told it 3 times. You ever realize that how powerful your story can be? Paul knew that his story, just telling how God worked in his life, would be a powerful statement to those in his audience. And that's important. Well, I had one of those bright, shining moments, not quite like Paul's. I didn't recognize it at the time, but my bright, shining moment opened the door for who I was and put me on the road to what God had called me to do, was when my father-in-law asked me to work with young people in that student center at Harding College. But I didn't see God's work at that time. I didn't notice it. But later as I look back, and that's how you know where God works. If you look back, you see how God has worked in your life. And He's put people in your life that have done special things. He put me somehow into the life, and we began supporting at our church, a missionary in Thailand called Kelly Davidson. Kelly opened doors for me that I cannot tell you, and taught me things about Jesus that was unbelievable. And he was a wonderful man. It was through him I took 4 trips to Thailand. One of those was a trip I took with my son when he was right out of high school, and we went on a mission trip, and guess who I met on that mission trip? Matt Reese. Isn't it a small world? But in seeing all that and seeing where Matt is today, knowing how Matt was one of the quiet leaders of that group, doing a tremendous work there, and he continues that today, and to see how God has worked in lives of people. He put lots of other people in my lives. I won't go into all of them, but but my father-in-law, Ralph Starling, is the one who shed the light. He's the one that said, here's what you need to come do. And when I did that, I saw it. I'm still doing it today. I volunteer my work and go out and work with the girls at Carpenter Place. I'm still doing work with teenagers. It's been a blessing. This is the final part. What's your story? Now, I'm not going to ask each of you to come up and take all this time, even though I was told I could take all the time I wanted. They wanted me to preach long. But what is your story? Have you looked back to see how God's working in your life? And then better than this, I can remember my dad telling me the story of how the garbage man invited his sister to Vacation Bible School, and he told that to me numerous times. He told me how God had worked in his life, and I knew it. I saw God working in their life, in his life. Have you told how God has worked in your life to your children and to your grandchildren? And you say, well, I've never thought about it, Tim. You see, how and when did God begin working in your life? And who taught you about Jesus? It may have been a teacher. It may have been a friend. It may have been a family member. Who modeled the Christian life that moved you to be a follower of Christ? Just think back on it. I don't think we think back and see. You see, if you read the Old Testament especially, God always was telling the story of what He had done with the children of Israel over and over again. That story is in the Old Testament because He wanted them to be reminded of how He works in people's lives. And He's worked in our lives, and you can look back and see how He's worked in your life. I encourage you to sit down and write it out. Think about it. God's got a story. Paul's got a story. I've got a story. What's your story? Do you have a story of how God has worked in your life so that you can know Him in His redeeming love? If we can help you in any way, if we can pray for you, if we can help you with your story, if you want to be baptized into Christ, I think we can do all those things today. Won't you come while we stand and sing?